This is episode 388 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Stern of the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's The Merry Wives of Windsor, Falstaff declares, "Let the sky rain potatoes." And in Troilus and Cressida, Thersites mocks another man's potato finger. To the modern ear, these references might sound absurd or even delicious or even a little bit off color. But in early modern England, potatoes were still a new and exotic arrival from across the Atlantic, often viewed as objects of curiosity, potent aphrodisiacs, or even medical novelties. The potato in Shakespeare's lifetime had not yet become the staple food that we think of it today. Introduced to Europe in the wake of New World exploration, the potato trickled into English gardens and apothecaries during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, just as Shakespeare was writing about them in his plays. Some claim that Sir Walter Raleigh brought it back from the Americas, and others suggest it arrived through Spanish trade. Regardless of its route, the potato's strange appearance and unfamiliar growth habits sparked both fascination and suspicion. During the reign of King James I, England saw a surge of interest in botany and natural history, and the monarchy encouraged experimentation with new crops. But did that include the humble potato? And what did early modern people really think about this odd underground tuber? To help us dig into this earthy topic, from folklore and foodways to medicinal use and social status, we're delighted to welcome historian Rebecca Earle. Rebecca Earle is a historian and professor at the University of Warwick, specializing in the cultural history of food and colonialism. Her groundbreaking research explores how everyday ingredients like the potato have shaped global identities and political thought. She's the author of Feeding the People, a compelling examination of how food became a tool of governance, and her work on early modern Europe offers unmatched insight into how New World crops, including the potato, were received in Shakespeare's England. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to let you know that you can follow along with this week's episode using our detailed show notes. These are available for patrons on Patreon, and when you log in, you can see illustrations of 16th century potatoes, woodcuts, and household manuals from Shakespeare's England. This is all curated to bring today's topic to life for you as you listen, and you can find all of it by clicking on the Patreon button. It says access the detailed show notes right from our regular show notes page this week at CassidyCash.com/episode 388. That's CassidyCash.com/EP388. And now let's dive into the history. Hello, Rebecca. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Did Sir Walter Raleigh introduce potatoes to England from his travels abroad? And if so, where did he find them?
Well, he absolutely didn't. So it's easy to answer that question. So to answer that question, I should say a little bit perhaps about where potatoes originate, and that will help explain why he didn't. So potatoes are native to the spine of mountains that runs all the way from Tierra del Fuego in the south of South America, all the way up really through the Rockies. In fact, that's really the same mountain range. And potatoes have been located all along that spine of mountains. People have found ancient wild potatoes actually in Utah and in the Rockies. But the domestication of potatoes occurred in Chile and South America, in the part of the world that we might think of as having been inhabited by the Inca Empire before the European invasion in the early 1500s. And it was Spaniards who invaded and ultimately overthrew the Inca Empire. And so they were the first Europeans to encounter potatoes. And so therefore, it's not a surprise that they were the first Europeans who brought them back to Europe with them. So it wasn't to the glory of Sir Walter Raleigh or Sir Francis Drake or any of the other people who regularly turn up on the list of potato heroes who gave this wonderful plant to the rest of the world, and particularly to Europe, as is claimed.
True to their reputations, however, to claim the glory for such as that.
Well, in fact, it really got up the nose of Spaniards by the 18th century, when, for reasons that we may or may not come on to talk about in due course, potatoes had a moment of real glory in Europe, and they started to become a sort of superfood that lots of different European countries in the 18th century were very interested in promoting, because they were seen as being cheap and healthy and nutritious, and a great way to build up a strong, robust working population who could man the ships of the various Western European navies, etc. And so lots of countries were interested in talking about how great potatoes were and how wonderful it was that they were brought back to Europe. And lots of people, not just in Britain, but even in Spain, would sometimes say, well, we're really very grateful to Sir Walter Raleigh for bringing back these great potatoes. And various Spanish historians and savants in the 18th century got really pissed off about this and were saying, wait a minute, it was us. It was we who did it. Thank us. I mean, nobody said thank the Incas, but it was a bone of contention in the 18th century.
Were there different varieties of potatoes available in different parts of the British Isles during this period? And how did regional cultivation or trade influence their availability?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is, what is a potato? So Europeans encountered all kinds of unfamiliar foodstuffs when they traveled to the Americas from 1492 and thereafter. I mean, all sorts of foods that are now absolutely central to how people all around the world eat. And potatoes are one of them, but we might also think of tomatoes. I mean, there was no pasta with tomato sauce in Italy before colonization of the Americas. There were no spicy chili peppers in the Indian subcontinent before this. There was no maize. There was no polenta in the region around Venice. There was no chocolate in Switzerland. I mean, lots and lots of foods that we associate with quite different parts of the world are actually native to the Americas and were part of what's sometimes referred to as the Columbian exchange, which is a sort of funny word having to do with Christopher Columbus and a sort of idea that foods from Europe, like wheat or olive oil, so, no flour tortillas in Mexico before this, that foods from Europe and from Eurasia came to the Americas with Europeans, and foods from the Americas traveled all over the world. That's what people sometimes describe, as I said, in the slightly peculiar term, the Columbian exchange. And among the foods that Europeans, and also people from West Africa who participated, some as conquistadors in these European and West African invasions of the Americas, some of the foods that they encountered for the first time were root vegetables, were tubers. So they encountered potatoes. They encountered sweet potatoes. They encountered cassava or manioc, as it's sometimes called. They encountered all kinds of different root vegetables or, roots and tubers of one sort or another. And Europeans tended to clump these things together into the category of roots. Botanists will tell us that sweet potatoes are botanically totally different from potatoes, and that both of those are botanically different yet again from Jerusalem artichokes. Have you encountered Jerusalem artichokes?
Only briefly. They're here, but me personally, I haven't really.
Yeah, sometimes you get Jerusalem artichoke chip, little sort of chips and that kind of thing. So they're also another tuber, famous for provoking horrendous quantities of gas, which people even at the time joked about. And they're also botanically quite different. But Europeans often, and in lots of different Western European languages, referred to all of these things as roots or tubers or sort of knobbly things of one sort or another, and didn't see these as fundamentally different. And that's why we call sweet potatoes, right? That Europeans thought of them as a kind of potato. And, as I said, the botanists can say, no. But from the point of view of the consumer, actually, they're not so different, right?
Well, certainly visually, they have the same general shape.
Yeah. And you might eat them
and they
in the
do
same
come out
way.
of the ground, and you bake them the same way. So, yes.
Yeah. And cassava also is something that comes out of the ground. It's a big root. So the very earliest potatoes, if we can call them that reached Europe were actually sweet potatoes. They're typical of the Caribbean. And they which is where Europeans got to first, their first landing sites were in the Caribbean. So they encountered those the very first. And so the very first potatoes that reached Europe were actually sweet potatoes. And those started getting grown actually in Spain, in the area around Malaga, pretty early. And they reached Europe quite early. It's a little hard to disentangle this because they're often called potatoes. And so the same word is used to talk about these different kinds of things. In England, when people at the time wanted to differentiate between sweet potatoes and potatoes, they might refer to sweet potatoes as Spanish potatoes. So sometimes people would say Spanish potatoes, but often they would just say potatoes, and you have to make a guess of what they might have meant depending on the date. So in some ways you could say there was a big variety. There was such a big variety that they weren't even all potatoes, if you want to look at it that way. But you're asking maybe something slightly different. You were asking about like what we think of as potatoes. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, I think I was, and it's funny that you mentioned sweet potatoes were called Spanish potatoes because we call regular baking potatoes Irish potatoes here, where I'm from. And that's the kind of potato I'm wondering if Shakespeare had them on his table, would it have been a big, Irish baking potato, or would it have been, some of the small, round, red, purple, yellow potatoes that we sometimes cook up and call, potatoes? I was just wondering what they might have looked like if we were to go buy potatoes or grow them in an Elizabethan garden. What would we have there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, one thing for sure it would be an Idaho baking potato, because that particular thing was something that was bred. I mean, they started the sort of antecedents of those, what are they called? Burbank russet type potatoes, the ones that bake so nicely, and they're so hard to get in Britain. Those were their antecedents, in fact, I think come from a variety that was found in Chile, but which was ultimately bred over the 19th and 20th century. So that particular variety is a modern variety. It didn't exist, but they were quite diverse. And we think of like these blue and purple potatoes that you can increasingly get now as sort of a novel thing, or, new. And if you ask people who are a bit older, they might say, oh, yeah, 40 years ago, those weren't so easy to find in the US. And those were certainly around. They were certainly around in the 18th century. The purple and violet and brightly colored varieties have actually been around for a very long time. And the very small salad potato type potatoes that we can also get and that are so yummy, those were also around quite early. Sometimes they were called kidney potatoes because of their small shape and their kidney-like curved appearance. So there was quite a wide variety of potatoes. But when Shakespeare talks about potatoes, and I'm sure we'll come on to what he had to say about them, he probably was thinking of sweet potatoes, which were actually being grown in Britain at Hampton Court, for example, in Tudor times.
In the garden there at Hampton Court.
Yeah,
is that correct? Am I following you? Okay.
Yeah.
During Shakespeare's lifetime, potatoes were often grown more as curiosities or ornamentals rather than food because, again, it was brand new. People weren't quite sure what to do with them. What do we know about the individuals or households who kept potatoes in their gardens? These ones that you're mentioning at Hampton Court, for example, are there any surviving records of how they were potted or displayed or maintained? Were they considered food in Shakespeare's lifetime, or were they considered a beautiful plant you might have?
Well, something can be considered both. So I think, first of all, I would say one shouldn't make it as a dichotomy between saying it's either an ornamental garden curiosity or foodstuff. Something can be both. I have one of my recently completed PhD students, somebody called Sarah Quinn, has written a wonderful PhD about the introduction of tomatoes into early modern England. And she shows that tomatoes were grown as an ornamental plant because they were considered absolutely beautiful and really lovely and remarkable, and that people generally didn't eat them because it was too cold most often for them to set proper fruit. This was the Little Ice Age era, and it simply wasn't warm enough to reliably get a crop of tomatoes off these plants. However, people were well aware that tomatoes were eaten in Italy and Spain and warmer climates where they did fruit properly. And people were perfectly aware that you could eat them if you could get your tomato plant to set fruit. So, it wasn't one or the other. There was some debate among botanists about whether potatoes were an interesting, attractive horticultural plant or not. There's one botanist, John Gerard, who's sort of famous for having been very rude about potatoes and that he didn't think they were really very good and very interesting, but he didn't like tomatoes either. But actually, we have quite a bit of evidence that ordinary people, particularly in Lancashire and Cheshire, areas that also had good communication with Ireland, where potatoes also landed pretty early, that people were simply growing them for their own consumption. So not wealthy gentlemen who had a botanical garden, they might grow a potato if they could get hold of some too, but that lots of people were interested in growing these new plants to consume themselves. And they weren't doing it, out of a scientific quest for having a collection of novelties, but as food.
In The Merry Wives of Windsor, Shakespeare writes, quote, "Let the sky rain potatoes," using the tuber in what seems like a humorous or even celebratory context. Explain for us what this line reveals about how potatoes were viewed in Shakespeare's England between their role as food, medicine, novelty, or something else entirely. Why was Falstaff having the potatoes rain from the sky?
Yes. So, to my knowledge, 2 references to potatoes in Shakespeare. It's as this quote that you just gave possibly indicates, it has a somewhat lascivious or lewd implication behind it. So this is Falstaff who's hoping for some sexual prowess to descend on him from the heavens, right? And this points to the fact the potatoes here probably, again, people mostly argue that Shakespeare probably had in mind sweet potatoes here. But I mean, in some ways, the point I was trying to make earlier is that we shouldn't be too fussy about, what type of root Shakespeare had in mind. That these new roots were often considered to have some slightly aphrodisiac qualities to them. So the sky raining potatoes is, may sources of lustfulness descend upon us. He also refers to aringos, which was another known aphrodisiac plant, a sort of, a candied stem of a plant. And why might this possibly be the case? I mean, the idea that a potato could be an aphrodisiac seems absolutely comical, right, to us. The explanation that's often offered goes back to the famous gassiness that Jerusalem artichokes were considered to provoke. And potatoes, these roots of all sorts, were often considered to be somewhat flatulent, as people would put it, likely to, produce farting, to be Shakespearean about it. And that, again, doesn't seem like something that goes very well with being an aphrodisiac. That seems like quite the opposite, we might in fact imagine. But the concept was that these windy roots, as they were sometimes called, were generally inflating. You would get filled up with a lot of air, and that would puff you up.
Which Falstaff certainly doesn't need any help with.
Well, that indeed is a very good observation. But the idea was that windiness would actually fill your body, and particularly the relevant body parts, with the necessary lift and luft.
I'm following. So it was just wholly a naughty joke on Falstaff's part here.
Exactly.
Yes. Quite appropriate for both his character and the play.
Exactly.
Well, as you mentioned, this is one of 2 references to potatoes in Shakespeare's plays, and his other reference comes from Troilus and Cressida, and Shakespeare has Thersites insult the idea of lust by referring to, quote, "luxury with his fat rump and potato finger," end quote. Now, you don't have to go very far to see what he's talking about there, but historians interpret this bawdy reference as both off-color or even an outright phallic reference. What does this line reveal about the potato's cultural associations in the 16th and 17th century? Is that also what you were talking about with Falstaff, of just the aphrodisiac reputation of the potato?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And I mean, there's some scholars who argue that Europeans were desperate. I mean, maybe not Europeans alone, but in this particular case, let's talk about Europeans or even people in England, since we're talking about Shakespeare, that they were generally on the lookout for aphrodisiacs, and that all kinds of new foods and new substances that were coming into Europe passed through an aphrodisiac phase, and that there was often a hope that this or that substance would have some titillating quality. I think chocolate, for example, or another foodstuff from the Americas, went through a phase when it was considered to be a little bit lewd, and there were all kinds of, nudge, nudge, wink, wink jokes about widows with their cups of chocolate, and we know what they're going to get up to. So lots of foodstuffs were labeled as, possible aphrodisiac.
I think I had hoped this was a reference to, and I don't know if they call them this in Britain, but we have fingerling potatoes here, which are shaped quite different from a sweet potato or a baking potato, or even the round, red, purple, yellow potatoes we mentioned earlier. They're very long, and they do look like, a long crooked finger. And I had thought this was a reference to fingerling potatoes until I was informed otherwise about the phallic reference. But would they have had fingerling potatoes in 16th century England, whether or not this reference in Troilus and Cressida is to that, obviously? But would that have been a kind of potato that might have been there for Shakespeare?
That's a really good question. I don't know. So the reconstructing what varieties of potatoes, were being grown is a really interesting and challenging subject. So I was commenting earlier on how we know that there were brightly colored potatoes. And we know that because we can have textual references to them. So people can comment sometimes on what sorts of colors potatoes might have. And sometimes people talk about what shape they might have. So like these kidney potatoes that were, sort of maybe heart shape might be a way of thinking about them if a kidney shape doesn't evoke a sufficiently clear image. We have comments. So we have comments like that. There's some visual material. So there are botanical illustrations from the 16th century onward that we can look at to see what sorts of sizes and shapes potatoes were in. But it's difficult to work out botanically what varieties they were. And there certainly were potatoes that I've seen in botanical illustrations, that whether they were fingerling potatoes, I can't say, but that were not simply spherical or oblong shapes, but had a more convoluted, knobbly shape. So that's quite possible. I mean, I think it was clearly a phallic reference in my view.
Well, yes, and Shakespeare, we would expect that to be there. So obviously that fits with what we know about him and his play, and Falstaff, and Thucydides' context. So of course, not contradicting that at all. But looking at the arrival of new foods and how they're often viewed with suspicion when they first arrive, in addition to being seen as an aphrodisiac, were there any myths or superstitions surrounding the potato when it first came to England? Was anybody worried about it or sort of hesitant to adopt it as a food source?
Well, one of my goals in life is to puncture those claims that people were suspicious and anxious about them. And I mean, I've spent a ridiculous amount of time writing about potatoes to the bewilderment of friends and family and colleagues. And one of the reasons I really wanted to explore the history of potatoes in early modern Europe, among other things, was that I found very dissatisfying the kinds of potato histories that it's very easy to encounter, which is that ordinary people who were terribly superstitious and were very conservative and wouldn't eat anything new if it wasn't mentioned in the Bible. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. And it was only when the elite started to eat them that ordinary people thought, well, if my betters are eating them, I'll tug my forelock a little and I'll have some of this potato because it's probably all right because Lord so-and-so's eating it. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought this does not match the way we think about the history of ordinary people in early modern Europe. It does not match the history of what we think about small farmers and peasant farmers, either in the early modern period or anywhere in the world. There's a lot of evidence that ordinary people are often quick to embrace anything that they think can increase their nutritional intake, can give them a bit more food, maybe a bit more reliable harvest. Potatoes are a super crop. They're very calorific. If you have a small plot of land and you want to get some good nutrition out of that plot of land, there's few things you could plant that would give you a better nutritional yield than potatoes. And they grow on land that's kind of marginal, that you can't use necessarily for growing wheat or oats or rye. They don't require so much water. They're high in vitamin C. I mean, not the people in Shakespeare's day were saying, oh, the vitamin C content of these potatoes is great. But they're a food that people can feel well and healthy on. And so some of the earliest evidence actually that we have for the cultivation of potatoes, aside from some gentleman botanists who grew them in their botanical gardens, is actually those gentleman botanists saying, peasant farmers seem to be growing these things in their gardens. And the other really interesting source that we have for the cultivation of potatoes comes from what are called tithe disputes. So you had to pay a tithe is an ecclesiastical tax that you had to pay to the church, and you had to pay a certain percentage of crops that you grew to the church. I mean, that was a state tax effectively. It wasn't something you chose to do depending on your, faith position. That was a tax. It tended to get levied on things that were grown for the market. And it tended to get levied, I mean, not things you were just growing in a pot because you were going to eat them yourself.
Something like for farmers that were commercially growing these.
Exactly.
Crops. Yeah.
Exactly. And it tended to get levied on the things that it had always been levied on. So if a new crop, let's say a potato, arrives, it actually took the church quite a while to catch up with it as a taxable good.
Before they decided, oh, wait, we need to be getting a cut of that too.
Exactly. And so you start to get disputes, actually often in the 18th century. So, long after Shakespeare's day, when the church, by then the Anglican Church had sort of wised up to the fact that people were growing tons of potatoes. They started being interested really in this. And they said, oh yeah, those potatoes, don't forget to give us a tithe on that. And villages sometimes went to court about this, and they would say, wait a minute, don't you try to tax us on our potatoes. We have been growing these potatoes for time out of mind, and nobody ever taxed us on them. We've been growing them for generations. Don't you come along now, Mr. Fancy vicar, and claim that you want your tithe on them. And so you then get court cases where villagers try to prove that they've been growing them for 100 years. So you could sort of try to backtrack a little bit on this. So far from being afraid of them because they were weird and peculiar and they, weren't mentioned in the Bible, which historians repeatedly like to claim made people not want to eat them, as if people were as if the presence or absence of cabbage or spinach in the Bible was a big determining factor. Far from that being a big problem, as far as we can tell, ordinary people were quite quick to grow them in places where they grew well.
Well, with all of this acceptance and growing of potatoes, and certainly the existence of people who were growing them at the commercial level, they must have been being consumed pretty regularly. Do we have recipes about how they were being cooked? Were they, boiled, baked, stewed, or something else entirely? What was the favored way to eat a potato in Shakespeare's lifetime?
Well, the fancy, posh way to eat a potato was in a potato pie. So I have dozens and dozens of recipes particularly from the 17th century, for potato pies and potato puddings. So let me describe what these are. They're sweetened potato custards where you mix up mashed potato with egg and cream and some sack, which is a bit like brandy, a kind of strong alcohol, maybe some nutmeg, maybe some rose water, perhaps some currants or raisins. And then you might, if it's a pie, you might bake it in a pie crust. And if it's a pudding, you might not put it in a pie crust, which sounds really odd. But actually, in some ways, it's a potato version of a pumpkin pie.
That's what I was thinking as you were saying it. It really turns into, like, we have here in the South of the United States, we have a pie called a buttermilk pie. And the potato pie sounds really similar. And so I'm going to ask you if this is correct, but you would have, the traditional pie crust that lines kind of the pan, and then you put all these ingredients in it and bake it. So when we're saying potato pie, it's not necessarily something that would have the pastry on top in that, lattice work look that we think about for an apple pie or something, but instead is more like a custard baked in a pie shell.
Yeah, and often it might be a puff pastry. So,
So it would actually be covered.
No, not necessarily. You could have a puff pastry base.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, you could also cover them. So these are expensive things to make because they'd involve sugar, which it was only on its way to becoming really cheap as the plantation slave system took off, making sugar cheap for Europeans at the cost of West Africans. Nutmeg was expensive.
Also very expensive, yeah.
Absolutely. Rosewater that might be something you could distill yourself at home, but that's a complex process to distill rosewater. So all of these ingredients are signal high, expensiveness. And so they were fashionable. And so that was something you might eat. There's a wonderful account of the Earl of Dorset, who, I think in 1624, supposedly died of a surfeit of potatoes that he probably ate in the form of a pie.
He ate himself to death on potatoes?
So it's claimed.
Well, then I guess that speaks to them certainly not being afraid of them at all.
Indeed. And so these recipes would often say, going back to pumpkin pie as being kind of an analog of these things, sometimes they would say, well, you can make these with, sometimes they were called Virginia potatoes, what we would, as you said, might call the Irish potato. They would say, you can make them with Virginia potatoes or with Spanish potatoes, i.e. sweet potatoes. So again, a sweet potato pie is something we're familiar with.
Now, Virginia potatoes, though, that's connected to the Virginia colonies in North America. And it sounds like the Spanish potatoes are coming from the Incans in South America and are more like a sweet potato. But the Virginia potato would have been something, would that have been discovered when they got here to places like Jamestown and Plymouth?
Well, this is another just tangled snarl. So
right. Okay. So we can't give anyone the crown there for where it came from, but that's kind of how it got associated.
Yeah. So, they were associated with the Americas and with Britain's American colonies. But the Virginia potato is the Inca's potato, is the Irish potato, is the thing we think of as a potato, even though it's not from Virginia. And it's not really from Ireland.
Well, you did mention that they were native here, though.
Well, that's true, but way out in the West, way out in the Rockies.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So they would have been an import even when they were eating them on the East Coast.
Exactly. So insofar as people were eating them on the East Coast in the 13 colonies, which by the 18th century, they were certainly doing, those were a kind of import from elsewhere. So the nomenclature gets awfully tangled. And as you said, Spanish potatoes being sweet potatoes is just a further complication.
As we dive into this tangled web here of the history of potatoes and try to untangle the roots, as it were, of exactly where this tuber began, I know that your work is a wonderful place to explore this history a whole lot further. So share with us now you have an extensive library on potatoes, but give us a few suggestions of a couple of things you would recommend we start with if we're new to the history of the potato and we want to learn more.
Oh, that's really kind of you. Thank you. Well, I've got a small short book, which is, how long is it? It's probably like 50 pages or something like that. So it's a little lighter, shorter intro to the potato. It's called Potato, and it's published by Bloomsbury. And it talks a bit about the history of potatoes. It talks about potatoes and culture. It looks at poetry. It talks a bit about the Irish potato famine. It talks about some of the things we were discussing here about this early spread of potatoes and who was growing them and who was eating them and in what different ways. And it talks a little bit about the 18th century that we touched on as well very briefly, when potatoes went through a popular moment as a superfood. So that would be a nice introduction to the potato. Or you could read my enormous potato tome, which is called Feeding the People, The Politics of the Potato, and which talks about the connections between politics and ideas about population and food and the potato's global history, which we haven't really talked about here since we're thinking about Shakespeare, but which also looks at the way the potato spread to China and to India and to different parts of Africa and all around the world, and looks at the potato from its origins in pre-Incaic times to potatoes right now today. So it's a much broader sweep of the potato's history. So you could look at either of those.
These are both wonderful resources, and we will place links to them in the show notes for today's episode, so you can go right to where you need to find the correct title and make sure that you get a copy and can dive into the history of potatoes as far as you would like to chase the history. And there is a whole lot to uncover. Now, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Oh, thank you very much. I've never been on Desert Island Disc. It's a famous radio program. And some people allegedly have their list of the 8 records they would take on to their desert island, in their desk drawer, and waiting for the telephone call from Radio 4, BBC Radio 4, to ask them on the program. I'm not holding my breath that they're going to ask me. So I don't have a back pocket list. What would I take? What I would take, actually, is because I think this would get me the same way the complete works of Shakespeare would get you quite a lot of reading material under, one rubric. I think I would say Remembrance of Things Past by Marcel Proust, because I've never managed to make my way through that. And I think that would keep me occupied for a long time. And because food is really central to that collection of memoirs and writings. So I think that would be something that would speak to my interest in food. And I could look for potatoes all the way through it, and it would give me a lot of books for one request.
Quite an appropriate selection, I think. I think that's a good one for you. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, typically and idiotically, I am working on something that actually has relatively little to do with food right now. And I'm writing about a ship. I'm writing about a Spanish ship that was sailing from Lima in Peru, heading towards Spain in the 1790s, it sailed into total chaos in Western Europe caused by the French Revolution. So when it left Peru in 1792, Spain wasn't at war with anybody. And by the time it got to Europe, Spain had been dragged into the Revolutionary Wars. And this ship had the misfortune of being captured at sea, not once, but twice, first by a French privateer and then by the Royal Navy. Why is any of this interesting? Partly because this ship was carrying millions of pesos of gold and silver, which was a lot of money in 1793. Its capture provoked a war in 1796 and upended the lives of hundreds and hundreds of people who were on the ship, or who had money invested in the ship, or who were involved in the negotiations about who owned this ship. It had a very complicated story that involved everybody from 8-year-old boys who were being sent to Spain to go to a military academy, to a Jewish translator who was involved in translating for the Spanish crew who didn't speak any English. And I'm writing the story about this ship.
That sounds fascinating. I can't wait to see that work come to life more fully. And if you would like to follow Rebecca's work, be sure to visit the show notes to find out more, so you can find out when you can read more about this. Thank you so much, Rebecca Earle, for being here this week and helping us explore the history of potatoes and how that history was alive and taking root in Shakespeare's England. We've really enjoyed having you visit with us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was wonderful to have a chance to talk about potatoes with you.
That wraps up our look at the curious and complex history of potatoes in Shakespeare's England. A warm thank you to Rebecca Earle for joining us today and sharing her expertise on how this humble tuber took root in the early modern world. To learn more about our guest and explore the resources mentioned in today's show, including related podcast conversations, visit the show notes at CassidyCash.com/episode 388. And if you'd like to dig deeper into this edible piece of history, members of Experience Shakespeare on Patreon can download our latest hands-on activity kit that lets you try out a few real 16th century recipes for potatoes the way they would have been done for Shakespeare's lifetime. Just head over to the show notes and click Access the Detailed Show Notes to find all of the illustrations and extras. And then if you'd like to dive in even further, click Experience Shakespeare to find out more. Again, all of these extras are at CassidyCash.com/episode 388. That's CassidyCash.com/EP388. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. Until next time, may your potatoes be properly planted, your harvest as mysterious as it is marvelous, and your dinner table be free of superstition. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.